Duke Aiona on the Republican side. We didn't even talk about his landslide victory over BJ PENN. Colin, what do you think happened there? I mean, he got crushed, and everybody thought BJ was so popular.
He did. Well, I mean, I don't think BJ PENN really ran much of a campaign. I mean, he really relied on his celebrity, and he did very few media appearances, which I don't really understand, because I thought that BJ PENN was pretty good when he was with the media. I mean, he's a charismatic performer. And he was good on the Hawaii News Now debate, I thought. I think everyone remembers that line when he turns to Duke Aiona and says, "Well, I'll just ask you, Uncle." I mean, that's one of the big things I remember. I think if BJ PENN had got the campaign infrastructure in place, he would have done a lot better. I mean, of course, Duke Aiona has name recognition. He's a trusted figure. I mean, some people say he only even got in the race because people were worried that BJ PENN was going to win. I do think that BJ PENN showed that there is support for running a more populist style, maybe, I don't want to say Trump, that might be going a little too far, but he does represent a lot of voters who feel left out. And I do think it represents the split you see not only on the mainland, but also here in our Republican Party between maybe the more Linda Lingle conservatives who want to just be to the right of the Democrats, and people who are really angry. I mean, angry at the state and want a more populist style campaign. So if BJ PENN came back in 2 years, and he really ran a professional campaign, he was ready for these media appearances, I expect him to do a whole lot better. And if Duke Aiona isn't in that race, he could really run away with it. The other person I wanted to mention, because he came in number 3, is Gary Cordray. And maybe if Gary Cordray hadn't been in that race, I mean, someone who also represented more, I think, of an evangelical vote, if he hadn't been in that race, some of those voters probably would have been BJ PENN voters too.
Colleen, how did BJ PENN's campaign play out on Maui?
He actually wasn't too far behind Duke. Duke did win in Maui County, but BJ was close behind. I think part of that too was, we were talking earlier about the frustrations that a lot of people had with some of the COVID mandates and restrictions. We had some rules that other counties didn't have, and so I think that might have played into it, his success there.
Did you have a chance to talk to BJ, Catherine?
No. He had said, "Oh, save a slot for me," and then bail at the last minute. It was interesting, though. We did have the Republican Party chair, Lynn Finnegan, in, this past week, just talking about the outcome and, the Trump factor, right? Some people might have voted for Duke Aiona because they didn't want BJ PENN because he represented Trump, which was a negative. So it's just interesting to hear.
Chad, what do you make of how well Aiona did, and what does it say to you about what might be happening for the general election?
Well, remember, there were 10 people running in the Republican primary for governor. That's astonishing. And I think Colleen's absolutely right. Several of those candidates were anti-COVID mandates and restrictions. Gary Cordray right at the top of the list, but others as well. I do think the Trump factor is there too. I believe during the super debate that we participated in, if I remember correctly, I think BJ PENN said he'd be supportive of Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. And if you look at it, it wasn't close. I mean, it was a complete landslide. And Duke Aiona has twice lost this very same race before. So I think there's a lot of factors at play. A lot of those other Republicans did not do well at all.
This is an interesting question. What do the panelists think about the Republicans having a governor and lieutenant governor pair who are both Polynesian? It's an interesting question. What do you think, Colleen?
I think it's great to see representation in government. A lot of times we hear people concerned about Native Hawaiians being displaced in their own home, their own islands. And so to have more people who understand, the Native Hawaiian perspective, the Polynesian perspective, I think that's good in politics.
What do you think, Colin? Do you think that gives, historically, Native Hawaiians have been Republicans. Some of the most, I think Prince Kuhio was a Republican, right?
That's right.
So, that's been historically. Do you see maybe a surge of Hawaiian interest in this race?
Potentially. I think people are going to give them more of a shot than they would have otherwise. Take a really careful look at Junior Tupa'i, and of course they already know Duke Aiona. The other thing I'd say about these two candidates is, to me, I know they don't agree on all the policy issues, but they seem relatively aligned in just terms of their personal manner. We know they're both very religious figures. They're both strong speakers from what I've seen. And so I don't think you're going to see this kind of strange phenomenon we saw 2 years ago with Andrea Tupola and the Republican LG candidate when they really couldn't get on the same page. Tupa'i and Aiona are going to be pretty united.
What do you think about the
About
the general for the governor's race.
well, it'd be interesting, to see. I don't know if there is enough support to get Duke in, like we saw with Linda. I can't believe it's 20 years that has passed.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, so I mean, it is interesting to see the Republicans run so many candidates in so many races because they're down to 4 in the House, 1 in the Senate. And, Lynn Finnegan says, I think there was, 20 at one time at the height of it?
We should definitely talk about the legislative races, but if I just might add, you had asked earlier, why haven't we had more success with the Native Hawaiian vote? I remember, it wasn't just Kaikahele, but Ikaika Anderson, Native Hawaiian, Pat Bronco, Native Hawaiian, mixed ancestry for a lot of these folks, and yet it's the Republican Party that's putting together a Native Hawaiian at the top, and I think that is intriguing, but it's also a very different Republican Party than the 1920s in Prince Kuhio.
Yeah. Khalid, on Maui, is there a strong Native Hawaiian presence politically? Do they tend to coalesce at all in Maui races?
Thinking about the candidates, Bisson is, Native Hawaiian, and I think that is big. When there was like a debate, and he started with an oli, and I think, that probably a lot of Native Hawaiian voters went, wow, okay.
He was tremendously popular. It was really striking how popular he was, considering he's never run for office before.
Yeah, definitely.